As much as UFC fights aren't scripted, there's an expectation for fighters to put up performances that'll at the very least impress the company's CEO whenever they get into the octagon. However, over the years, some fights have proven to do the complete opposite of this, instead leaving Dana White absolutely annoyed. What matches fall into that category and how did they go? Stick around to find out. Starting off with a fifth from a while ago, Anderson Silva versus Demian Maia. If you've been a UFC fan for over a decade now, you'd be surprised you haven't heard any particularly impressive reviews of this fight, yeah? Well, that's because it really was that unimpressive, which is crazy given the caliber of fighters both guys are placed in. Anderson Silva, for one, had been named one of the outright greatest mixed martial artists of all time by Dana White himself at the time of the fight. Being one of the most direct and technically vicious players the company has ever seen, Silva spent his career accumulating an impressive striking accuracy of 60% out of an attempted 1,300 strikes. His UFC Hall of Fame career saw him become the fighter with the most successful title defenses in UFC middleweight division history, and the second most in all divisions, the longest title reign in company history with a whopping 24-57 days, multiple fights, and knockouts of the year, and a ton of other crazy feats. Silva's opponent on this fateful night in 2010, Demian Maia, might not have been as decorated, but he was definitely not one to mess around with. We mean, many consider him the best ground fighter in the UFC, thanks to his unique skill set with both single and double-leg takedowns. He also has records like having the most rear-naked submission wins in company history, second most top position time, third most control time, and sixth most total fight time in the UFC. One thing was clear, even back in 2010, these two were champions in their own rights. So when middleweight contender Vitor Belfort got injured, and the long-awaited title shot came from Maia at UFC 112 in Abu Dhabi, everyone expected it to be a fight for the books. It did end up getting into the books, but it was so disappointing, not just to fans, but to Dana White as well. Maia had gone into the fight with a 12 wins for 1 defeat, with 5 of his 6 UFC wins coming by way of submission. Anderson, on the other hand, had come off a couple of underwhelming victories over Patrick Cote and Thales Leites, but was still the obvious favorite. When the fight would actually take place, the so-called favorite chose to talk trash all match long instead of fighting. Silva never actually had Maia trapped or in danger of getting flattened after the first couple of rounds. All he did was preen, pose, and dance around the octagon for the 5 rounds the match lasted. It ended up being enough to get him a unanimous decision win over Maia, but it was clearly not the kind of performance anyone wanted to see, particularly not the company president. When the fight ended, Dana White was so disappointed and annoyed that he refused to present Silva with his title belt after the fight. Oh yeah, Silva's manager Ed Soares had to do that himself, and White hasn't done it yet. In the interview after the fight, he went on a pissed rant about how the two guys had put on one of the worst title fights in UFC history. He ended his rant by sending actual threats regarding Silva's future with the company, vowing to strip Silva of his title and cut him from the company if his next fight was anything similar. That's right, the big man definitely lost it on this one. It actually took an apology from Anderson Silva and his manager to calm the UFC boss. End of the day, the only positive from the fight was for Maia, who said years later, "That fight changed my career. A lot of people started to recognize me as a fighter. Even though I lost, a lot of good feedback. People started to recognize me more because I was that guy that fought Anderson." This next fight didn't exactly have any positives, which isn't a surprise for reasons you'll find out soon. Curtis Blaydes versus Alexander Volkov. This match had a number of differences from the previous one. First, it took place a full decade apart, which doesn't say much, except that Dana White had become even more blunt with his words than he was at the time of the Silva versus Maia fight. Also, the two fighters involved were in very different stages of their careers at the time. Unlike Silva and Maia, who were already established and successful fighters, Curtis Blaydes and Alexander Volkov were really just putting their resume together in the UFC. Blaydes, for one, was just in his 6th year as a professional MMA fighter. He had made his debut in the UFC in April 2016 at UFC Fight Night 86 in a second-round TKO loss to Francis Ngannou, but had gradually made his way into the conversation of the most promising in the company. Blaydes had 2 very embarrassing defeats on his records. both against Francis Ngannou, but had also beaten the likes of Cody East, Daniel Omialinchuk, Alexei Olenek, Alistair Overeem, Justin Willis, and Junior Dos Santos, gotten a couple of Performance of the Night bonuses in the process, and was on an impressive run of 13 consecutive heavyweight takedowns. Volkov, on the other hand, had a bit more experience, having turned pro in 2009. However, he also had joined the UFC in 2016, a few months after Blades, and at the time of their meeting, the Russian was far from the favorite. Curtis Blades was very aware of his on-paper edge and made sure to milk it before the match. Dude really did a lot of trash talking, promising fans a stand-up war between himself and Drago. He also added that he'd end up ragdolling the former Bellator MMA fighter. D-Day came in June 2020 at the UFC Apex in Las Vegas, and Curtis won. So why did Dana White get pissed off then? Because the fight was nothing like Blades promised. Although he started with as much energy as one could hope for, the fight ended up being a lopsided affair that required a decision to conclude. To make matters worse, Blades was obviously tired and gassed out by just the third round. No one can fault him for an absolutely bad performance, but it was clear that he got the victory only because Volkov was really off form, not because Blades was able to deliver on all the mouthing off he did prior to getting into the Octagon. Fans weren't impressed, and so was Dana White, who really went at the young Blades in a post-match interview saying, "He talked a lot of coming into this week. I don't think you talked the He talked and came in and performed like that, talking about ragdolling people, not getting paid enough, and that he should be getting a title shot." And he wasn't done yet, adding, "With his performance tonight with his cardio, I wouldn't wait around if I was him. I'd stay active. I have nothing against the kid at all. But when you talk like he talked this week, man, you better come in and whoop somebody's ass. When you perform like he performed tonight, you look stupid." Yeah, the boss clearly wasn't pleased. But the craziest part of this whole episode is yet to come. You see, despite getting called out for his underperforming, Curtis Blades still didn't shut up. Instead, he excused his mediocre performance, saying, "I was exerting myself all the takedowns, looking to get ground and pound. He had a long guard and a body shield, and the unique dimensions of the body had different obstacles that I could have prepared for more." He then continued to add, "The W is a statement. When a guy is equally good as you are. I beat a guy who's on my level." Dude really wasn't having any of Dana White's wrath. Today, Curtis Blades and Alexander Volkov are ranked 5th and 6th, respectively, in the UFC heavyweight division, so it looks like it all worked out. Moving on, we have a quite similar match that got Dana White just as pissed off. This time, the fighters were Quinton Jackson and Rashad Evans. For this fight, on one side of the Octagon stood Quinton Jackson, which is probably not a name that needs an introduction, most likely for the wrong reasons. Quinton has an infamous reputation for making some very disturbing sexually harassing acts and comments, which has soiled his reputation as a fighter. However, for the youngins who only started watching MMA in the 2010s, it's important you know just how good this guy actually was. During his first spell in the UFC between 2006 and 2013, he won the UFC Light Heavyweight Championship and was also named the 2007 Fighter of the Year, amongst other honors. Across his spells in Bellator MMA, the UFC, and some other promotions, Jackson proved to be not just a skilled fighter, but also a true entertainer with his eccentric personality. His opponent at UFC 114, however, is an even more iconic fighter. Rashad Evans came into the company around the same time as Quinton, and not only won the Fighter of the Year award immediately after Quinton, but also won the UFC Light Heavyweight Championship once. Rashad also recorded the second most takedowns in the light heavyweight division history and was inducted into the company's Hall of Fame in 2019 after over a dozen years of consistent performance. Seeing these two face off in 2010, at the prime of their careers, had all the details of a blockbuster match written on it. Dana White himself had teased the fight 2 years earlier on an episode of The Carmichael Dave Show when he said, "I'd love to see Rashad and Rampage. I think that's a fun fight." It's not every day we get to see matchups that the UFC president himself has been looking forward to. But UFC 114 had even more hype around it because of the cultural value it carried. This fight marked the first time two African-American fighters have ever headlined a UFC event. Because of this, it was heavily publicized as it marked a big step in the company's cultural development with its fan base. To add to all these, there is also the fact that Quinton and Rashad had beefed each other at UFC 100 and engaged in some sort of online trash talking in the build-up to their fight. Both dudes legit went on Twitter threatening each other with comments like, "At training camp in the UK, everything is on and poppin'. Rashad is gonna hate May 29th. And, bring your pillow 'cause you going to sleep, boy. Dem chin stands ain't gonna help." The stage was set for what was expected to be one of the wildest slugfests ever. Come fight day, Quinton and Rashad appeared to have completely different ideas on how the night would turn out. Rather than produce some fireworks and go for the jugular, Evans decided to take advantage of his better grappling skills. So that was essentially the whole fight two heavyweight material fighters grappling and trying to get a submission instead of knocking the other out flat. End of the day, Rashad Evans got the win via unanimous decision, but one could tell from how calm the arena was that no one was impressed. Here's the crazy part about this fight, though. At the time, Dana White said absolutely nothing about the fight. No appraisal, no disappointing remarks, nothing. This is probably because of how big Rashad and Quinton were at the time, and Dana wasn't looking to offend two of his best employees. UFC 114 also did pretty good television numbers, so there wasn't much to complain about at the time. So the boss legit had to hold down his anger till about a year later. Oh yeah. Sometime in February 2011, rumors of a potential rematch between the two fighters broke on the internet. It seemed everyone wanted to give both guys a second chance to deliver on the potential of their fight. Well, everyone, but Dana White. When he was asked about the possibility of a Rashad versus Rampage 2, Dana didn't hold back, saying, "Talking's fun before the fight. But if you do all this talking, and then you go in there and don't fight, who wants to see that crap again? Rampage Rashad, the freaking snooze fest? I don't want to see that freaking fight again." That definitely sounds like a man who is pissed off at us. And the best part about Dana White getting pissed off? No one escapes his anger. Not the B-list fighters, not the multiple-time championship winners, and not even the last stylebender himself. Yep, this next match that pissed Dana White off was between Israel Adesanya and Yoel Romero. If there's one UFC fighter that doesn't need an introduction, it's Israel Adesanya. The first two-time UFC middleweight champion, second most title fight wins in UFC middleweight division history, third most total fight time in the middleweight division history, multiple Performance of the Night awards, 5 successful title defenses, and the very cocky owner of a long list of other awards. This guy is literally one of the faces of the UFC. And this has pretty much been the case since his arrival in the promotion back in 2018. Adesanya's opponent at UFC 248, York Romero, is even more accomplished in the fighting industry. Sure, he doesn't have half the achievements the stylebender has in the UFC, but Romero is an iconic veteran of every form of wrestling. You'll need a whole history class to get caught up on how widespread his impact has been, but to summarize, Yoel is a 5-time medalist at the World Championships, the 2000 Olympic silver medalist, a 3-time World Cup winner, and a 5-time Pan-American champion. Looking at the resumes of both fighters, UFC 248 was not just another fight. It was martial mixed arts, bringing together two of the best 185 lobbers in the world from two different eras for an epic battle. He had to render a full-ass apology the day after for his insensitivity on the matter, but after the fight, it turned out that wasn't the only apology Izzy would be making. The fight was Adesanya's first time defending the title he had won in grand fashion against Robert Whittaker, and despite being the main event of the night, it ended up being one of the worst UFC events of all time. For the entire 25-minute duration, there was no action from either side. It was more of a staring contest, with only glancing blows, than an actual fight. Adesanya waited for Romero's attacks, which never came. Instead, fans saw the veteran making antics and stationary movement more than anything else. He eventually defended his title with a unanimous decision, but there wasn't much to smile about after the fight. First came Dana White's usual unfiltered review, and this time, He completely blamed just one of the two fighters for the fight being a flop. Talking about Yoel Romero, the UFC president said, "He literally went out and stood in the middle of when the bell rang in the first round, just stood there with his hands up. You shouldn't even be here getting this title fight. It should be Paulo Costa. If he didn't get hurt, you don't even get this opportunity. You go in, and you do everything you can to win that fight. He literally did none of that." He went as far as admitting that the company's matchmakers didn't want to put the match on, since Romero was on a two-fight losing streak. However, White revealed that the goofy fan in him hoped it could actually give something fun, only to be terribly disappointed. Soon after his rant, Romero was out of the UFC and hasn't returned since, but the veteran has also put out his opinion of the matter, saying, "The UFC was pampering him, pampering Izzy. If he was intimidated and didn't want to exchange punches with me, that's on him, not on me. If he had wanted to be a smart, strategic fighter, that would have been another thing. But that's not what he did. He was just running all over the place." Clearly, the 1999 World Championship winner wasn't going to let the blame be put on him. It took 2 years, but eventually Adesanya also took his stand on the fight, calling the Romero fight his worst ever match before adding, "That was the first time people were just like, boring. After that fight, I was fighting. He was just standing there. Why are you blaming me?" But that was my first time where I kind of felt like, yuck, I hate to say it. The fans turned on me in a way, where I was like, wait, what? Now they're saying I'm sh**. Every man defended his reputation, but the common factor remains that this fight got Dana White very pissed off. If there has ever been any match that managed to get the UFC president even more pissed, it's this final match we have on our list. Clay Guida versus Gray Maynard. Don't tell Dana White we said this, but if there is one fight on this list where he should have seen a bad fight coming, it is definitely this one. Our reason for saying this is in part because of the profile of the fighters involved. On one side of the fight was Clay Guida. Don't let his recent form or energy fool you. At his peak, Clay was as good as any other superstar we've mentioned on this list. He's a UFC Hall of Famer for a reason after all. Since joining the UFC way back in 2006, Clay has gained a reputation as one of the most efficient and consistent fighters the company has ever had. Despite not having any major championship reign, he has had 6 Fight of the Night performances, 2 epic Fight of the Year performances against Roger Huerta and Leonardo Santos, has the 4th most bouts, the 2nd most control time, and the 3rd most decision bouts in UFC history. The only issue is this: Guida's peak didn't last long enough, and he also happens to be tied with Jeremy Stevens for the most losses in company history with 18. For UFC on FX4 in 2012, Guida's opponent was Gray Maynard. We'll not bore you with the details. Maynard is easily the least impressive of all the UFC fighters mentioned in this video. Dude spent nearly a decade in the UFC but never quite got that moment in the light, except that one loss to Frankie Edgar in 2011, simply because he didn't have the skill set for it. Already the duo didn't have the normal flair of a UFC classic. But to make it even more unlikely, when Maynard was put up against Clay Guida, both men were coming off losses, and when they got into the octagon it showed. Clay Guida, with his usual unassertive approach, and Maynard just trying to be safe, was the order of the entire 5 rounds of the fight. At first, the fans cheered for Guida. His impressive footwork was a new part of his game that fans thought promising, but soon after, it turned out to just be some sort of elusive tactic. Eventually, fans began supporting Maynard not out of sentiment, but simply in the hopes that at least one of the two fighters would do something exciting. This fight got so bad that even match officials had to weigh in. Referee Dan Miragliotta warned Guida for backing away too much at some point, and UFC Director of Communications Dave Schaller also took to Twitter to express his disappointment during the fight. Even Dana White didn't wait till the end of the fight to express his anger, tweeting, "I thought it was impossible for this fight to suck. I was wrong." And the first time I have ever seen Guida get booed out of the building, I am booing too. End of the night. Gray Maynard won by split decision, 48-47, but no one took note of that. All everyone spoke about was how bad the match was, and when Dana White would finally give his full review of the fight, here's what he had to say. The fight sucked. I don't know how to expand on it anymore. I don't think that was a split decision at all. Nobody can win or lose a fight when the guy is running around in circles. He was literally running. I had some guys who are fans on Twitter saying, "Great footwork." This isn't expletive dancing with the stars. You can't win a fight by running around in circles. That's not how fights are won. That's as pissed off as it gets. Which of these fights do you personally find the most disappointing? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section, and before you leave, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Octagon Rivals so you don't miss the next ones.